So, how excited are you right now out of 10?
Oh, about 15. And it's because this
You're
is...
like a dog who hasn't been walked for a month.
Now, we should say right off the bat, this is a bespoke episode where all we are talking about is Succession and Succession-related content. So if you are not up to speed with Succession, switch this off immediately because it is going to be spoilers to the nth degree.
Look, I think you gave it like nearly 2 weeks before you watched episode 3, Connor's wedding, and the rest of us in your social orbit were just like... I couldn't even look you in the eye. Like, I was just sort of walking around going like, I can't, she'll read it in my eyes, she'll know.
Well, I want to ask you what you think the definition of a spoiler is, because after episode 3, Connor's wedding, everyone knows, what we're talking about if you've watched it. Why am I dancing around it? Logan Roy dies, okay? I kid you not, I'm not exaggerating. I reckon about 25 people over the course of that week texted me to go, just checking, have you watched the latest episode of Succession? To the degree that I actually thought, okay, Logan...
This isn't just a wedding, is it?
This isn't just a wedding coming up. Like, something's happened here. And so I started thinking, is it possible that Logan Roy's died? I thought maybe Kendall had killed himself. But whatever, the sheer volume of people who were not doing spoilers but just asking me had I watched was almost a spoiler. It almost became its own spoiler being asked about it.
Yeah, but you asked for it. You asked for it by delaying. Like, I mean, what reasonable person would do that?
Well, because I'm
you
tired
don't have binge.
and I don't have binge. And so I'm reliant.
Far out, man. Like,
I'm reliant on somebody else who went away, who was incredibly selfish and left town. And so I had to wait till he got back to go and,
Could have watched it at my place, mate.
Could have actually. But then that would have been disloyal because I promised to watch it with this other person. So...
Mate, if the other person chooses to go out of town, I reckon...
Fuck him.
Fuck off! Fuck off! Does anybody in the world say fuck off better than
Okay,
Brian Cox?
before we go into all the Succession-related content...
Let's do the fluffing. Let's do
the fluffing. Okay. So let's just start with the Connor's wedding episode. So did you see that coming at all?
No.
Okay, so what was your reaction when you were watching? And
I sort of assumed that they have to kill Logan off at some point, but because... there was still so much Logan-related fuckery happening. Like, this is just a general swear, moratorium on this episode, I think.
Totally.
Sorry, Mum. It's just that he was so deep in, because of the big deal, you keep thinking, well, there have to be two parties to this to make it a tense and ongoing situation. So I think my brain was lulled into a bit of... security that he would keep living until this fight to the death between him and his children over this deal was over. But in some, it's absolutely spectacular stroke of just burning the villages.
Didn't they?
Plot-wise.
You and I also tragically have had the experience of a sudden death. And didn't they capture that sense well, like the complete discombobulation of that moment, particularly when you're not in the vicinity and attempting to process what you've just been told.
And just that kind of almost sort of sickening sense of the center of your earth shifting.
Yeah.
And you sort of feel like you're a bit high or something, and you kind of you're looking around and physically everything around you looks the same as it did 3 seconds ago, but actually everything's changed, even though it looks the same. And the performances of the Roy children, all absolutely superb in their own way. And we'll talk in a minute about how they did all of it. But the funny thing is, not very funny, but because you didn't watch the episode for so long, I actually had a message from somebody fairly senior at the ABC. Let's just call him Justin Stevens, saying, mate, I just noticed from Sales's socials that she hasn't watched the Connor's wedding episode yet. Do you think we ought to warn her about because it was Dad suddenly having a heart attack?
Yeah, it was not dissimilar to my father dying. Oh, yeah.
And I then felt terrible that I texted Murph and I'm like, mate, do you think Justin thinks we... And she's like, oh, I didn't think of that either. Jeez, we're good friends, aren't we?
And then coincidentally, at exactly the same moment that they're having this conversation, unbeknownst to me, I've read a piece in the New York Times about Cornell University and how they've basically stood up to some students who wanted them to introduce more trigger warnings in lectures because an English lecturer was teaching a book that had a rape in it. Somebody in the class who had filed a harassment complaint against a colleague felt triggered by it. Her friend started this petition and they said, well, we demand more trigger warnings on stuff. And then the Cornell Uni, whatever their equivalent is of their vice-chancellor, came back with a very vehement, no, this is an educational institution. We're in favour of free speech and people learning and, you know, life is uncomfortable. Get used to it kind of vibe, not quite that blunt.
But that's how you would have phrased it.
Anyway, I then send the New York Times article to Crabb and Murph with this long rant about, wow, this is just incredible and, you know, this is fantastic that people are finally standing up to this nonsense. So I went on this massive, massive rant. Meanwhile, they're like, should we give Sales a trigger warning about it?
So I'm then holding a side conversation with Miranda saying, is this our answer, do you think? And then something else weird happened that so I watched the first episode of this show called Beef, which looks hilarious and it's like really clever and smart, and I'll tell you about it later, but there is like a suicide sort of scene in it, which is supposed to be a bit of a visual gag, but absolutely not for me because of, you know, my brother killing himself a year ago, and there was elements of the scene that really just I was laughing along, and all of a sudden I was in just insane howling floods of tears. But like, how would you how would you do, like, you know, it's hard. I don't think I wish there'd been a trigger warning, because I'm like, well, how would you phrase that?
Same
like,
with
how
Succession, like for me, like just for anyone whose father died suddenly of a heart attack and they were in a remote location and they got called while their father was still alive but unresponsive, you might find this episode triggering. Like, you know, it's kind of, you just can't possibly do it. But in terms of back to the question of killing off Logan Roy, funnily enough, I had just had a conversation about this with my friend Evan Williams, who's a writer, and we were talking about, you know, does Logan have to die? And Evan made the point, and I've seen it actually made by the writers of the show. He's like, the show's called Succession, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
if you don't...
Running out of opportunities.
Yeah, and we kind of had reached the conclusion that if you don't kill off Logan Roy, you've kind of violated the whole premise of the show as set up in season 1, episode 1. And so we felt that they would, but I thought it would be like final episode terrain. But actually it's a brilliant decision to go earlier because of the creative possibilities.
And because they've been so firm about this being the final season, I mean, his death would be the ultimate cliffhanger. Like, it would be unsatisfying to not see what happened after that.
Exactly,
because
it's a much
the
better
more
thing.
you think about it, like, there's a lot of the story to unfold after he dies, so it makes sense to kill him off this early. But anyway, tremendous piece of...
I'm just looking at my phone because I've got that much Succession content that I've had to write the most extensive notes. So the place where Evan and I had this conversation was, we went to this event where episode 2 of Succession was screened in a cinema, and Nicholas Braun, who plays Greg,
you went there.
cousin Greg, was
so
there.
Cool.
And so there was a little Q&A with him. He was fantastic. He was so interesting about things. So a few things that I gleaned from him that I thought were really great was, the person questioning him said, since the show's come out, you must have rubbed shoulders with some uber rich people who, you know, kind of see themselves in it. What's their reaction to the show? And it was so interesting. He said, I don't actually think the uber rich see how dreadful the Roys are. He said, I think they watch it just to see themselves. It's almost like porn, was how he described it.
Wow.
The other thing that he said that was fascinating was, he was asked about Greg, who's, you know, a fantastic character, and how he got into the Greg character and the Greg vibe right. And he said, when they were about to start shooting season 1, he was minding this dog for somebody, and he said the dog was like really super needy, and he said to the degree that it was annoying him all the time, and he'd be like constantly saying to the dog, just get out of here, get. And it suddenly struck him one day, like, that dog energy, that's Greg's energy. And so even season 1, when you look at his haircut, he's got this shaggy haircut like a dog. Yeah. And so he said the whole time
he's always wearing that anorak that's like a dog jacket.
Yeah. And it was just, I thought that was so brilliant, because when he said that, I was like, oh, I completely get it. The other thing, I was on this deep YouTube rabbit hole last night of Succession stuff. Oh God, it's never ending. It's replaced Harry Styles.
Thank God for that, at least. Harry's relieved.
There was a Nick Braun bit where he was talking about, again, prior to starting the shooting, the question was about the essence of Greg's character, and he basically said he's a lurker, and he said that was something that was not kind of common to me because he said, I get out of awkward conversations really quick as a human. I don't lurk.
Yeah.
And so he said to get in the right vibe, what he did was he would walk into shops and stand awkwardly close to people and then strike up awkward conversations like about their watch or their haircut or what they were looking at or whatever. And then he said his goal was to keep it going as long as possible and to just not avoid the awkwardness. Isn't that brilliant?
Wow, that's like the sort of nerd equivalent of Leonardo DiCaprio living as a savage in the wilderness.
Isn't it? I thought that was just what a fantastic idea to like get into that zone. And he said, he finished it by saying, conversations will actually go a lot longer than you can imagine. He was like, people will just keep talking to you. So it was quite interesting. But what a brilliant thing to do.
Well, one of the things that I just love about a lot of people in the cast is their capacity to physically assume the attributes of the characters. Like, there's something about the way Greg carries himself that is implicitly obsequious that makes him look more weak-chinned than he actually is.
100%.
And so you see him doing publicity and you're like, oh, you're such a handsome guy.
Same, that's Tony Hale as well, from who we love from Veep and Benedict Society. You see him in reality and you go, oh, that dude's extremely handsome and elegant. And yet everything I've seen him in, he looks geeky and awkward.
Yeah.
What about, speaking of the physical embodiment, like Kieran Culkin, if he was here, would be sitting like with his legs up like this. He never sits straight in a chair. He's always like curled up into the chair or legs hanging over the edge. Or that's fantastic. The other thing I saw on the deep dive last night was Brian Cox. They were asked about their favourite insult, and Brian's like, oh, I don't pay attention to that. I'm just in the moment. And then he said, but I tell you what, people come up to me in the street and they want me to tell them to fuck off. Down the barrel of their camera. I get have to do selfies with people telling them to fuck off. Now, why would anyone want me to tell them to fuck off? It's just a mystery to me.
Oh, God, he's genius.
So anyway, back to the shooting of the show and the reaction. Okay, so what was your reaction then when Tom's rung them and gone, something's really badly wrong with your father?
Well, it's a classic Tom situation because he's gaming, like he's not telling them the whole truth, which is that he's obviously dead. So he's kind of you can see his brain is working to establish how this situation is going to pan out for him.
Right.
And he's too scared to confirm what's happened. So he's kind of like stringing them along, partly out of compassion, I think, but also partly out of his natural tendency to play for time and work out, what this is going to mean for him, because he's, sensationally withdrawn his support from the siblings and thrown his lot in with Logan, who's now, expiring on a plain floor. Yeah.
See, I thought maybe it was a double cross. I thought because they didn't show Logan straight away, and you couldn't see what was happening. So I'm watching it thinking, oh wow, this could be would they be this big of an assholes? Like, this would be such an asshole thing to do. And then there's a certain point at which you see in the background, they still haven't shown Logan, but just in the out of focus background where Tom's on the phone, you see someone doing chest compressions.
Yeah.
And so then I was thinking,
oh, this is real.
Shit.
Either it's real or it's extremely well staged.
Yeah. Although Brian Cox in some of the publicity claims that it's an open question because you never actually see dead Logan.
Say that,
I thought that was maybe
there's
interesting.
a body bag that comes off the plane, so...
The other thing was they had to take Brian out for lunch. This was another thing I heard. So I highly recommend the HBO Companion podcast.
So
Succession.
good.
It's so good.
I haven't listened to that to date, but like...
Oh, you will really like it.
Yeah, I've listened to the one on on Connor's wedding, but I haven't listened to any of the other apps,
they're all fantastic. Yeah. But so the Connor's wedding one where they interview Brian Cox in the back half. Firstly, I adore his crankiness. Yeah. He is so deliciously cranky, but also kind of not in an alienating way. Like he gets revved up, but he's still kind of charming. It's hard to explain.
Yeah, also he's very, very unprecious about what he does. So he's like a beautiful, beautiful counterpoint to Jeremy Strong, who, that original GQ profile that was so incredibly controversial.
The New Yorker.
Oh, it was New Yorker,
the GQ
that's
was
right.
The follow-up, yeah.
Oh, right, okay, sorry, yeah. And one of the cast members, I think Kieran Culkin, said, well, the thing is that, we all realise this is comedy, but, Jeremy thinks it's Shakespeare.
Yeah, that was fascinating.
And didn't Brian Cox in that say something like,
He basically, like, that kid could try acting, basically, rather than like embodying that. He was like, I worry about him, how tortured he kind of is in the process.
Yeah.
Brian in this podcast said, so they took him out, Jesse Armstrong, the showrunner, took him out for lunch to say, we're killing off Logan in episode 3. And Brian said the first thing he said was, I assume I just get paid for the whole season, though, right? And his take on that was like, because that's what you ask when you grow up in the circumstances I did in Scotland. You just want to make sure you're still getting paid for the entire thing.
Yeah.
So I wondered if it was a double cross. And then, of course, I just sank into the moment because you realise it's not shit. They're actually going to kill off Logan Roy. So I didn't notice at the time because I was so absorbed in what was happening. But that's a single take from when they...
Right.
So from when...
I didn't really clock that until I listened to the podcast either, and then I was just like...
I want to rewatch it now because that's incredible. So they basically filmed it like a play. So I think it's from the moment when Kieran Culkin and Jeremy Strong go to that private room and they get on the phone. Then it goes for 27 or 28 minutes. It's one take.
Yeah. Then they go upstairs and find Shiv and...
Yeah, that's extraordinary.
And nobody thinks of Connor.
Do you know, I loved one of my favourite bits in that episode. I think the Connor character's evolution is really great. When they finally think to tell Connor, and the first thing he says is, he never liked me. It was such a great reaction. Yeah, so it's this single take. So apparently when they were doing it, the kind of cameras they use don't have the...
They've got 10 minutes to roll in them,
So they had to hide batteries on the set so that people could take turns swapping out their battery and putting in a fresh one. And then they did it. They only did the one take. Such a flex. It's incredible. They did the one take and then that was it basically.
And then Matthew McFadyen was who's another great physical actor because he's an intensely handsome man who somehow makes himself repellent in this series. Like there's something
incredible.
So icky about him that you forget that he's really handsome. And then you see him doing publicity and you're like, oh my God. But apparently they had him on the other end of the phone while they were shooting this. And he was in London in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And he was just on the phone, and this is the point that Jesse Armstrong makes in that podcast, that the cast are super generous to each other. And so they are,
Yeah, that's right. Just adds to that kind of authenticity. I mean, I'd love to ask them if I was ever interviewing them, do the real life relationships ever start to replicate what they are in the characters? Because like Brian Cox he's much older than them. He is like a fatherly kind of thing.
But a peppery sort of...
Peppery kind of intimidating dude. I would wonder if you did, start to behave. And Kieran Culkin and Sarah Snook seem to have this kind of hilarious, riffy kind of relationship. And clearly from those pieces we were talking about, Jeremy Strong's a little bit isolated from the rest of the cast. So you mentioned before, and we've had this sitting in our little chat turn list for weeks and weeks, waiting till we could talk about Succession to bring it up. So there was 2 profiles of Jeremy Strong. One was in the New Yorker maybe a year ago, longer? A while back now, a couple of years maybe. Yeah. And it was... as Crabb said, there was some fairly frank assessments of Jeremy Strong and his extreme method kind of acting. And when it was printed, people came out, friends, to defend him, to say that's pretty cruel. But in it, even the cast members of Succession had been kind of a bit unflattering of him. And then, did you ever read the GQ piece?
Yeah, I did.
Oh.
I just wanted to punch him in the face by the end of it.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, GQ, I was saying to my mate, GQ has a house style that I would call tortured bro. Don't you think? It's like tortured bro. They just run everything. They hit F1 and it puts it through a style thing. Yeah. And then it adds like, Jeremy Strong turned up the collar on his Armani coat. Yeah. And it's like, and he said to me, man, I was reading some Kierkegaard last week, and it's just like this kind of shtick.
Oh my God. My balls were aching by the end of that piece, frankly. Sorry. I mean, it was sort of interesting, but I also just went, everyone is trying so hard. Just have a cup of tea, guys. Because they do like hiking and, and he's wearing gaiters or something. Man, and then there's a brief kind of digression into the fact that he always wears brown, and why is that? And then there's like...
Oh, yeah, it was just... And there's a lot of the reporter... One of the hallmarks of Tortured Bro is that there's a lot of first person of the reporter, and the reporter will be, like, grappling with, I'm trying to just understand this cool, but it's like there's a coolness or something like,
Yeah.
hey, I'm a cool guy and he's a cool guy.
Yeah,
and
we
I
can
think
be
we can
cool
just play
guys.
pool and we can be cool guys together.
Yeah,
And just
and
trying to understand him.
It's always a slight threat that fly fishing might be involved
Oh,
at some point.
it's
like a little
always-
bit. I've read a bit too much Hemingway, and I haven't quite got it out of
there
the
could
system.
be rock climbing.
Possibly.
There'll be
Yeah.
some eating. Maybe a protein shake could be involved. There'll be a lot of stuff like that.
And then maybe, depending on where they are in their 12th step programs, maybe like a lot of scotch at some point.
Oh, 100%.
Jazz, do you think?
Would they be jazz or would they be like acid house or
Ooh,
something?
No, acid house. Perish the thought. No, there'd be some sort of like, there'd be some kind of obscure punk reference that's very.
Oh, yeah.
It'd have to be very underground, I think.
And maybe like Jeremy Strong lifts the needle on his original 1972 such and such
you
turntable.
got it. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
It's my weakness, he confesses, as he lights up a filterless Gitan.
He owns he owns 56 turntables and they're all housed in a,
Oh my God.
this is how these articles
He's
roll,
definitely
right?
a 56 turntable, like
I
high risk.
I like those GQ articles because I do find them wildly entertaining, and the people give a lot of access because they're usually very they're positive in a, as Marina Hyde once said about the one about Brad Pitt, like what agent or therapist would possibly give the green light to him hawking Ralph Lauren
Not
in
once,
a
but
dank
twice.
cabin. But the thing that really was like in that piece was, so of course they get around to talking about the controversial New Yorker piece,
Yeah.
which was so harsh, of Jeremy Strong. And the thing that was killer, like, so Jeremy Strong's backstory is he kind of grew up in just like, lower middle class, bumfuck America.
Mm-hmm.
And he ends up working super hard and like ingratiating himself to people, including Daniel Day-Lewis. He gets this minor
He's
thing
being a
and
runner or something.
He's being a
but he
runner,
makes
but he's
himself,
like, he makes himself like he's just, bends over backwards, and he's always like, so the kind of vibe of the article is he's a bit of a suck up to everybody to try to get ahead.
Yeah.
Anyway, then when they ask him what was his reaction to this piece, he goes, you know what, I just felt I wasn't angry, I just felt the biggest sense of shame because I felt like everyone knows that I'm a striver. I am a striver. I am that person. I have tried to get out of my circumstance, and I just felt this most enormous shame that it was so obvious. And it was just like,
Yeah.
oh, God, you poor bastard. And so, it was really crushing.
And I think there's a certain amount of truth to that, like that there is this sort of obligation to be effortless. And that's not possible for everybody, right? Like,
Yeah.
and there's no doubt that like his ability is unbelievable. But also, I think when you are, where I think that line of analysis stops is, I think you can be a striver and you can work hard, and I don't think there's a disgrace in that. But I think when you take yourself so seriously that you impact people around you with the extent to which you're demanding to do things your way or whatever, that there is that is not a victimless crime.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, it's kind of, I don't know, I've always thought, like, I've worked with some amazing people over my years, and I've always felt like I would take a slightly less amazing product for ease of workability and just for being a nice person that everyone wants to work with.
Yeah.
I still want super high standard, but I'll skip the gold Walkley if I don't have to, deal with very, very difficult personalities and people that make everyone's life around them a misery.
Yeah.
But, it's hard to...
But
obviously,
difficult people are important to have around. They sort of teach you how to deal with difficult people, which is,
true.
significant. But like, I also think, and I am, as you know, just a dirty old femo, but I also think that there is something really gendered about this kind of obsession with character acting, in Hollywood and beyond, this idea that, you hand yourself over 1,000% to the role and you go and live in the wilderness for 30 days and you go or you live as a gang member, or you do whatever, because traditionally it's usually men who have time to go and do all that shit, because the chicks on set are just like juggling shit. Like,
That show...
and old Jeremy Strong's, at some point in the interview, he's like waving to his children where they are being looked after by their mum up in, as he goes off for a 9-hour hike with this dickhead from GQ. I just think, wow, mate. Like, and I understand that is, I tend to turn to that analysis quite easily, but I just think, I wonder if he would be getting away with all this sort of shit on set if he was, Sarah Snook.
Call My Agent parodied that whole thing so brilliantly in an episode that I laughed for days after it about this
God, I love
actor.
that show.
Oh my God, what about the episode where the actor, he's played like that Leonardo DiCaprio Revenant style dude, and then he can't get out of character.
He's sleeping in the doghouse.
He's living in the yard, and his wife calls the agent to come and like try and get this sorted. And then it ends with him going to that shoot. And they've prized that disgusting, stinky blanket off him, and
he shows up with sorry, you'll have to translate that from the hystericalese for me. I can't remember what he showed up wearing.
He shows up with just a bag that he's holding, and you just know that he is pretending to have dropped the character. Anyway, he opens the bag and it's like the stinky duffel coat or whatever's in there. Anyway, it's however it's done. Oh my God. I laughed for days. I've not watched it again since that one time, but oh my God, it was just absolutely incredible. Oh yeah. So 2 other little things. So in the HBO pod, there's a fantastic episode where, I think it might be episode 2, they get an actual American divorce lawyer to come in and talk about how would Tom and Shiv's divorce play out in real life. And is that a thing that you ring every divorce lawyer to conflict them out, and what do you do?
Such brilliant tactic. I love it. I mean...
Yeah. And so this woman, the divorce lawyer, who was quite famous, Laura Wasser, I think her name is, she said, yeah, that is a thing. But she said her advice would be, if she was, say, Tom's lawyer, would be... Right, he's just said to Shiv he wants it to be amicable. So now that he's done that, a nice move for him to do would be to go, look, you want one of those people? There's a couple of them I'm happy to like call them and I'll say it's completely fine and you can have one of those ones that you want. And then she said that would like take the temperature down, then Shiv can get one of those people. Anyway, it was very interesting hearing her talk about these kind of like very rich people divorces and how they tend to play out and so on. The other bit of Succession content that I adored was the LA Times did an obit of Logan Roy as if a real media mogul called Logan Roy had died, and it had all of the attention to detail and effort that those great American newspapers put into the obits of people like that. Oh God, it filled me with delight when I read it.
Yeah, and then I noticed they had to put an editorial note saying, this is actually an obituary of a fictitious character. Oh my God, the world's full of literalists, isn't it? But anyway, it was a very enjoyable read.
Now, I can only assume the timing of this was done very deliberately, right?
My God.
But are we talking about the same thing?
Murdoch's.
Vanity Fair?
Sure.
Vanity Fair, Murdoch's profile. Absolutely incredible. So where do we even start?
Okay, so I first saw a story, I think it must have been in the Herald or something, that referred to this explosive Vanity Fair piece. And look, there are combinations of words that set my pulse racing in the world, and one of them is explosive Vanity Fair piece. Because I don't really read Vanity Fair, but every now and again they just pull something that is extraordinary out, and this piece is extraordinary.
Well, oh my God. So firstly, Vanity Fair, I think dating from the Tina Brown as editor era, they do these deep dives into things that it's like you kind of have to work for Vanity Fair to know the people that are going to give you the access, right? So reading it, I think it's fairly indisputable that Jerry Hall was a major source for this article.
Well, she signed the thing saying she wouldn't be a source for Succession.
Oh, wasn't that incredible? That was my favourite bit of colour, that their divorce settlement included her agreeing she would not provide the makers of Succession with any ideas for the program. What a piece of detail.
Who would divorce Jerry Hall, by the way? She just seems like incredibly good fun.
Well, that was the thing that seemed...
Was this the smoking, apparently?
Well, she claimed... Well, she didn't claim. A friend of Jerry Hall's
Sources close to Hall.
Sources close to Jerry Hall. Sources intimately familiar with Jerry Hall.
Wow. I love that Mick Jagger got involved as well.
Oh, that was the colour, the detail. So Jerry
This is a man who married Jerry Hall by slaughtering a chicken in like Fiji, wherever it was, and eventually like their divorce actually turned on the question of whether they were legitimately married at all because they'd married in some like Fijian ceremony.
Wow, I didn't
or
know
Balinese. Maybe it was Balinese. It was a holiday location anyway, and they got married, and there was like some chicken thing. I studied it in law, like in family law.
Wow.
It was, yeah.
So
Anyway, he's
so
back on track, old Mick.
So they think they're going all right. Well, sorry, Jerry Hall apparently thinks they're going all right, and then she gets a text message from Rupert just going, "Look, I'm really sorry about this, but it just isn't working out. I think
I've got to end our relationship."
Yeah, and so
Dumped
but
by
then
email.
she
After
gets
Donald
this,
Trump has asked her to be like Secretary of State or something.
Well, that
What
was the other thing that was fascinating was like she and Trump. Clearly, there was issues where Jerry Hall seemed like a bit of a lefty, and she didn't really fit in that world. But so Jerry's inherited this house in the UK that she's gone and moved into, and then she's discovered that there's some kind of cameras or surveillance or something. So Mick Jagger comes into it because his security firm comes around to debug Jerry Hall's house. It was just like,
yeah.
So the thing that, I mean, look, there was a lot of things in that stuck with me. The succession detail was one, but the other one was, oh my God, Rupert Murdoch's been really sick and they've kept that really quiet.
Right?
Yeah. Like a lot of series of serious and bad illnesses. So
Including breaking his back on some yacht and
Yeah.
then being medevaced out.
a couple of rounds of pneumonia.
Yeah.
And, yeah. So, but yeah, what an exhilarating read. But I mean, it was chock full of incredible detail, but it didn't really give me any better insight into who is likely to take over there.
Well, I mean, if we could pivot now to the discovery process, to the Dominion lawsuit.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Do you have the sense this podcast could go for 8 hours?
It could.
Yeah.
Let's go. I mean,
Yeah.
I love that you're up for that for once. You just reflexively
No.
looked at your watch and gone,
No, Lisa Miller just tried to ring me and I could feel it vibrating under my bum.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Well, that's the effect that I get when Lisa tries to call me too. So, I mean, it's extraordinary to me that the news kind of legal team would allow this to get to this point. Like, if you knew the material that was available for discovery, surely you'd settle before discovery rather than after. Like, it's just
Also knowing how sick Rupert is and that he was going to potentially have to appear, then...
But he already had to give a deposition, which was a debacle. So, like, what was that piece that I was... there was a piece in the Fin the other day that was a really good exploration of what had come out during the discovery process. And basically there's this just terrifying email trail of one by one senior figures at Fox saying, oh my God, this like ballot machine stuff is bullshit. There's nothing to it. But also freaking out that because they made the call on election night on Georgia, that was seen as sort of, you know, turning the tide and kind of making it clear that Trump hadn't won the election. The whole Fox viewership was like turning against the network with such violence and fleeing it that the ratings were like plummeting. So this became this kind of intense financial crisis, which is why they, despite saying behind the scenes, well, Trump's nuts, Giuliani's nuts, and, you know, all of this, the election was stolen, is completely specious. On air, you know, all their big people are saying, well, look, you know, there's a lot to be concerned about with these ballot machines.
The just rank dishonesty it's just gobsmacking.
And the failure of journalism, I mean, just is bizarre. Like,
how can you call it journalism?
Well, I'm not.
No, I know. That's what I'm
I just
saying.
think
Like, how can one? I don't know how to use.
It's such a portrayal of what actually is the handling of information in circumstances like that. And the most shocking thing in this Fin piece that I was reading was, and they went through all of the sort of on-air Fox people and just had this brutal kind of what they said on air, what they were saying in their emails, which is just
brilliant.
like shocking, like Tucker Carlson and all of them. But the extraordinary thing was that this, you know, this idea that there was evidence that the Dominion voting, like ballot machines, had some weird, you know, tampering that delivered Trump votes somehow to Biden, was being handled as a genuine news story. but there was no evidence. But there were people saying, "Oh, there is evidence. You know, there's software details," and essentially the evidence came from some email from this woman who said she'd had a vision or a dream about it. Like, I mean, that seems to be the basis of this complete charade.
It's truly gobsmacking.
Yeah.
But it leads me back to one of my favourite lines in Succession when Logan goes to visit the APN newsroom floor and gives them that pep talk.
Oh,
and
you
Greg's
pirate!
and Greg's watching it and he goes, he's just cruising on the phone to Tom. He's just like cruising around on the floor like Jaws. But it's like if everyone in the film Jaws worked for Jaws.
Oh, God, that writing is just...
And I've spent.
Chef's kiss.
All right.
Postcoital cigarette.
Yep. So there you go. We will. That is our Succession episode. Last time we did this was for the Americans, actually.
Yeah.
So let's.
That was very satisfying.
All
Thank
right.
you all for your
See you
indulgence.
next time. Back to regular programming next time. Oh, I almost forgot before we go. We've got a Brisbane live show coming up.
Brisbane Live Show.
Brisbane live show, May the 19th. There's a handful of tickets left. I always love the Brisbane show. The atmosphere
Yeah.
is always super
always a
fantastic for me with the home crowd.
Yeah.
It's a week after my 50th birthday, in fact.
Floral tributes to the stage door.
So if you
No,
want,
really don't.
so if you want to come to the Brisbane show, go to the Chat 10 website, click on events. You'll find all the details and be able to book some tickets. Run, don't walk.
It's going to be spectacular.